Hi, can you all hear me? So it's a real privilege to be here with you. I want to thank Trish for that awesome introduction. And I want to share with you the good news about teaching and learning in the Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools. So I'd like to open my talk with a compelling question, or an essential question, something that we've been thinking about in ILTs. And that essential question is, what's the chance that a child born in the United States in the bottom fifth of the income distribution will someday reach the top fifth? Well, we know the answer to this question because of an amazing study that was led by Raj Chetty, an economist at Stanford University. And I know that everyone in this room knows the answer to this question. Because the answer to this question is, it depends on where the child lives. So if we take a look at a map of America, you can see that Chetty did this analysis. And in some cities like Salt Lake City, 10.8% of children in the bottom quintile make it to the top quintile. If you look at Chicago, it's 6.5%. In Washington, D.C., it's 11%. And Atlanta is 4.5%. What do you think that figure is in Charlotte, North Carolina? It's 4.4%. Charlotte, North Carolina has the lowest rate of intergenerational mobility of any city in America. And what this means is that poor children in Charlotte have a more difficult time escaping poverty than poor children in any city in America. And the news isn't great for the United States because among all the Western industrialized nations, poor children in America have the lowest rate of intergenerational mobility. So when you see statistics like this, does it make you ask questions like, is Charlotte, North Carolina, is the United States still the land of opportunity? I know I ask that question when I see data like this. For example, in the national newspaper, The Atlantic, there was an article that came out after Chetty's report, and the title said, "Where Children Rarely Escape Poverty, Charlotte, North Carolina ranks low on upward mobility, but the city is trying to make the American dream accessible, more accessible for everyone." And Charlotte has embraced the challenge. After this report came out by Raj Chetty and his colleagues, there was an opportunity task force that was created that you've probably heard of. And in the front page of the local edition of our newspaper here in town, it said, "Task force focused on Charlotte's poor. We are not going back to business as usual." One of my heroes is from the civil rights movement, and you may have heard of her. Her name is Fannie Lou Hamer. And she's a daughter of Mississippi sharecroppers, and she and the heroes and heroines of the civil rights movement transformed American democracy. And my favorite quote by Fannie Lou Hamer is this quote. I love this quote. She would often say this when things were really bleak, really dark, and it didn't look like we could transform American democracy. She used to say, "I am sick and tired of being sick and tired." And I want to tell you something. I am sick and tired of being sick and tired of bad news in Charlotte. And what I want to do today is I want to ask you this essential question. How can we increase the chances that all children in Charlotte will not only escape poverty, but also live happy and successful lives? This isn't just a compelling question. It's not just an essential question. This question is essential to the survival and success of American democracy. And so when you all work day in, day out tirelessly to improve opportunities for your kids, you're not just improving education in America, you are helping to strengthen the foundations of American democracy. So, I'm sick and tired of bad news. And I'm not going to tell you any more bad news. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk to you about the good news. So what is the good news? Well, I'm going to share 4 pieces of good news with you. So let me start with good news number 1. You have, as a district, identified an important problem space. Now, I want you to think about this, principals. Any given day, you have hundreds of different problems you could focus on. In Clayton, and Trish, and Nicolette, and Diane, and those of you in district leadership, hundreds of different problems that you could focus on. But you have focused on one problem that's a problem for almost all U.S. educators. And you've done that through the ILTs by focusing on how we help kids understand complex text. So I want to show you a couple of figures to help you understand why this is a really critical problem for you to focus on. So this is from a national survey. It's called the Early Childhood Longitudinal Survey, or ECLSK. And I want to orient you to this figure. The first thing that I want you to see is that there's this vertical axis, and that's just the percentage of kids who are proficient in different literacy skills. And then over here, you'll see that there's a horizontal axis, and it goes from the fall of kindergarten at school entry all the way to 8th grade. And then you see a bunch of lines that mostly go upward, and those are different literacy skills. And what you can see here is that when we think about, if we define literacy as the ability to read words, America's doing a pretty good job with that. Things like letter recognition, beginning sounds, ending sounds, sight words. 80–90% of US school children are proficient with those word reading skills by the end of 3rd grade, and by 8th grade, almost all kids have mastered those skills. When we think about word comprehension and literal inference and even extrapolation, even those lines are going upward all the way to 8th grade. But I want you to focus on 2 lines that barely move. And those are these 2 lines all the way here at the bottom. And I've drawn a green line because I want to show you whether you're an elementary school principal or whether you're a middle school principal or a high school principal, this is the problem you've got to grapple with. And that problem, colleagues, is the fact that our kids in America, regardless of their race, ethnicity, income, family income, or English language proficiency, struggle to evaluate complex nonfiction text and text that has a lot of complex grammar. And so this is a problem that we face in America across all grade levels and with all children. Did you know that most US 8th graders struggle to evaluate complex nonfiction texts? Only 1/3 of US 8th graders are proficient at this particular literacy skill. So you must be asking, like, what is complex nonfiction text? I'm going to do a lot of read-alouds today, and here's the first one. So here's an example of understanding complex nonfiction text. And the point that I'm going to make is that to understand this kind of text, you have to have these knowledge-based competencies. This is a lot of technical stuff, so let me unpack what I mean by this. Do you know the Magic Treehouse series? My kids really love those books. Well, this is a nonfiction series, and here's a passage on rainforest. And what I want to do is read you this passage about animals in the rainforest. So just listen and think about what I read for you, and what you will hear is that there's a lot of complex vocabulary and syntax. The rainforest is home to unique plants and animals that don't live anywhere else. When a rainforest is destroyed, these plants and animals are destroyed with it. Some rainforest animals are becoming very rare. For example, there were once thousands of woolly spider monkeys. Now there are only a few hundred. This is bad news for many plants, flowers, and fruits that need spider monkeys to carry their seeds from place to place. Because of the interdependence between animals and plants in the rainforest, what hurts one organism could hurt many organisms. Okay, so think about a 1st grader, 2nd grader, struggling 3rd grader, struggling middle school reader, those are the kids that I worked with, having to evaluate this complex piece of nonfiction text. And then imagine the student having to answer this question about what they read. What will happen to the woolly spider monkey if its habitat is destroyed? It will become a species, it will become extinct, it will become unique, it will become endangered. Okay, everyone, my goal today is not to teach you a bunch of literacy lessons, but it's to illustrate an important point, and here's the point. The point is that many kids are struggling with knowledge-based competencies because the ability to decode and read that text fluently is necessary but not sufficient to comprehend it. Kids need different types of knowledge. They need knowledge of really high utility or very useful academic words that they're going to see across content areas, across grades, like unique. They need discipline-specific words that are specific to disciplines like natural science, words like endangered, interdependence. They need knowledge of specific topics like rainforest, and they also need general background knowledge of topics like ecosystems, because we're only going to teach them about one or two ecosystems. The question is, can they transfer that knowledge to tasks requiring understanding of other ecosystems? And that's a tall order. And so when we look at 8th grade, and we see that only 1/3 of 8th graders can evaluate complex nonfiction texts like this, we should know that we are focusing on the right problem. But here's the other really alarming point. How large is a rich-poor gap on knowledge-based competencies on tasks like this? We know the answer because a couple of researchers did an analysis, and they found out that what you can see in 8th grade is that the literacy gap is a knowledge gap. Only 1/3 of US students in middle school possess the knowledge-based competencies to read complex nonfiction texts. And students from low-income families enter high school with average literacy skills on these knowledge-based competencies, 5 years behind those of high-income students. Now listen, high school principals. I don't know of a single intervention in America that can close a 5-year gap in literacy skills. There is no amount of remedial instruction in high school that is going to close that gap. And so the first bit of good news is that you have identified an important problem space, because the problem that you are trying to tackle to help kids read and comprehend and evaluate complex nonfiction text is a challenge for all American educators. And this is the challenge that we have to focus on, because when you talk about the achievement gap between rich and poor children, it's not that large on those procedural word reading skills, especially by 2nd and 3rd grade. But those achievement gaps on these knowledge-based competencies get larger and larger and larger over time. And that's good news, because of all the things that you could focus on as a district, I think you have identified an important problem space. And this is the challenge facing all US educators in our society. Okay, let's talk about good news number 2. You're probably thinking, Jimmy, that didn't sound like good news. That just sounded like more problems. So I'm going to talk to you now about some solutions. So number 2, good news number 2 is you have identified a practice that catalyzes ambitious instruction and student outcomes. Did you know that? So remember at the beginning of today's talk when Trish said, if you're a Practices Matter principal, raise your hand. Well, I was hoping that we would give those principals a standing ovation, because the reason we have an answer is because those principals worked with me on a study. So let me tell you about what we learned. So what is that practice that catalyzes ambitious instruction and student outcomes? The practice that we're going to talk about is academic writing. Isn't that appropriate, given that over 6 ILT sessions, we've been focusing on academic writing all year? And so here's what I want to share with you. What I want to share with you is that there is like a 150-page report called Practices Matter. It was conducted by the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Schools and Reed Charlotte and Harvard University and my colleagues at the Reed's Lab. And it included a representative sample of 30 CMS schools. So there's CMS, they're the schools. And let me tell you a little bit about this survey. And let me tell you what we learned from the survey. One is that those 30 CMS schools are a random sample of the entire district. And so because we drew those schools randomly from each of the learning communities, whatever lessons we learned from these 30 schools, they're going to apply to the over 100 K-5, K-8 schools. We also surveyed over 900 teachers in the month of May, where I hear you all are very busy. And we connected what those teachers told us in these surveys to their student achievement outcomes. So we have data for over 900 CMS teachers and over 12,000 students, K-5. And unfortunately, I just showed you the answer to the question that I wanted to ask you, which is, what do you think the participation rate was? My colleagues at Harvard said, good luck, Jimmy, you're going to have 40%. Some of my colleagues here in CMS said, you're going to get half if you're lucky. 87%. Do you know why? Because you're CMS, and you're an amazing district, and your teachers are amazing. So we got an 87% participation rate, which means that there's no bias in these results, right? Because all the teachers are basically taking the survey. And the question that we wanted to answer in the study is, which practice matters most? So each of the teachers took a 30-minute survey, and they told us about text-dependent questioning, read-alouds, fluency, lots of different activities. Which practices matter most? And which practices matter most after we statistically control for all those things that teachers have no influence over, like their students' demographic characteristics, like the skills that their students enter their classrooms with, and many, many other features of the broader school context. So here's what we did. We asked teachers about academic writing. So we asked teachers questions about academic writing, and some of those questions that we asked were things like, how often do you teach your kids to write an opinion piece giving reasons for the opinion? Number two, how often do you write an informational piece that contains a clear topic with supporting details? And then we asked a host of other questions just about academic writing and fluency and phonological awareness and other word reading skills to see how often this occurs. And then we asked teachers in the 30 Practices Matter schools about their school context. We asked them about their teacher professional community. So teachers told us whether and to what extent teachers in their schools trust each other. Teachers told us how often, to what extent they feel respected by other teachers. And so this is a lot like the Insight survey. They're telling us about the broader school context. And they told us many, many things about their schools and their teacher community. And so the first important finding that I want to share with you is about academic writing. Now, you all are very smart leaders. And if I were to ask you, what are you worried about in a survey? You're all going to tell me, Jimmy, what I'm worried about, other than people aren't going to take it, but we fixed that problem, is social desirability bias. Everyone's just going to tell us they do a ton of academic writing because they know that's a good thing to be doing this year. Well, I have news for you. Not only are CMS educators amazing, hardworking, they're also very honest. Because here's the first important finding I want to share with you. One of the most important findings from this report is that in the first year of EOG testing, which is third grade, so we give EOG tests, first time it happens, third grade, academic writing is the least commonly taught literacy practice. In CMS, you know how often academic writing occurs in grade 3? And by the way, this holds across most grades. 1 in 5 instructional days. 20% of instructional days. It happens less frequently than fluency instruction, phonics instruction, phonological awareness, comprehension strategies, even academic language. So let me show you this little box plot. It just shows a distribution of teachers on this measure of academic writing practices. And what you can see here is that in this box plot, there's this vertical line, and that's just the median. That's the average. So on average, teachers teach academic writing 20% of instructional days. Are you surprised by that? I have to tell you, like, the best research to do is research that surprises and sheds new light on problems and solutions. 1 in 5 instructional days. But I know you're sitting in your seat right now and you're thinking to yourself, Jimmy, I'm a principal, and I don't want to just know that certain levers are being pushed. I want to know which of these are potential causal levers that actually are related to how well my kids do, especially in high-stakes tests like the EOG. I love Clayton, and I love Frank, and so I love test scores, but I also know that it's not just about test scores. But this is an important one, wouldn't you say? All right, so let me show you the answer to this question. Is academic writing a high-leverage practice? Something that we've been focusing on this year. The answer is very subtle, and the story is less black and white than you might think. Because it turns out that academic writing does matter, but it matters in, as I said, a very subtle way. What we find is that in grade 3, the relationship between academic writing practices and student grade 3 EOG reading scores is stronger when teachers perceive that the teacher community is strong. So is there a relationship between academic writing and students' EOG third grade reading scores? Yes, but it depends on how strong the teacher community is. And so let me show you this figure and this result from the report. This is a graph, and again, on the vertical axis, you'll see EOG, and EOG goes from low to high, and those are third grade, end of grade reading comprehension scores. And then you'll see over here on the horizontal axis, percent of days that include writing instruction, and that goes from low to high, 0 to 100%. And then there are two types of schools, and that's what those two lines. The bottom line are schools where teachers perceive that the teacher community is very weak. There's not a lot of trust among teachers. Teachers don't feel respected. They have a hard time working together. And the line up here is typical schools where the teacher community is strong. So if we look at these results, what we find is that the amount of time spent on academic writing is positively associated with EOG scores, but only when teachers perceive that the teacher community is strong. When it's not strong, we find no evidence that there's a real relationship. I think that's good news, because what that's saying is something that you've known all along. Teachers cannot do this alone. They must be working with their colleagues, and they must trust their colleagues. They must feel respected by their colleagues. And there must be a sense that the overall teacher community is very strong. And so what's the good news? The good news is that you have identified an important problem space. You have identified a practice that catalyzes ambitious instruction and student outcomes. And good news number 3 is you have developed a learning-focused infrastructure, ILTs, to grow these practices. And CMS is part of a strong educational ecosystem. And so when we think about ILTs, which have now been in place in CMS for 3 years, I've had the privilege of attending many of these sessions over the last 3 years. This is where I've learned a lot about the good things going on in CMS. And when I think about ILTs, I have a question that always comes up. And it's a question that I want to ask you as we think about this learning-focused infrastructure. And that question is, who is a critical catalyst for strong ILTs? I mean, who's the person, not that makes or breaks the ILT at a school, but is a real catalyst? Well, I have an answer for you, because researchers just conducted one of the largest studies on school improvement in the United States, and it's called Investigating the Links to Improved Student Learning. And what these authors find is that at the University of Minnesota and the University of Toronto, a group of researchers studied 180 schools across 9 states for over 5 years. They looked at many, many different factors that can influence student achievement. And what they concluded is we have not found a single case of a school improving its student achievement record in the absence of talented leadership. Not one. And so what these authors conclude is you can try a lot of different reforms in American education. You can try to improve reading or math in the elementary or secondary grades, but you can't do it unless the principal is the catalyst. But principals, you cannot do it alone. You are not Superman or Superwoman, right? Sometimes you are asked to be Superman or Superwoman, but you cannot be that every day for every kid. And you cannot do it alone. And so what the University of Chicago says in its very famous framework of essential supports for student achievement is that principals are the catalyst for school reforms. They are the catalyst. They ignite and they sustain school reforms like learning-focused infrastructures, but they catalyze 4 things that actually help improve student achievement. And those 4 things are improving parent-community ties, because you cannot do this alone. You need parents who are very engaged in your kids' education. Teachers need to have strong professional capacity. Teachers need to be in a strong school culture and climate where they trust each other, feel respected. And there has to be a student-centered learning climate where there's safety and order. And there has to be ambitious instruction that goes beyond basic skills. And do you know what else? Schools, of course, exist in an ecosystem. Schools are part of a local school community context. And if there's crime and violence in that context, it's going to be much harder to catalyze all these essential supports that are needed to improve student outcomes. So I have a question for you. about this learning-focused infrastructure. And the question that I want to ask you is, what do you think happens when there is a learning-focused infrastructure across the whole district? What actually happens to student achievement when a district tries this out for 3, 5, 10 years? So I want to show you this graph. And this graph is a graph that shows us test scores, achievement scores for third graders in the 2,000 largest school districts in America. And this is based on a data set that was created by Sean Reardon at Stanford University and my colleague Andrew at Harvard, where they collected achievement data on 3 million students. Every student in America, every school district from 2009 to 2015. And what we did here is we just took a vertical, just a small cross-section of that data for the 2,000 largest school districts in America. And what you can see here is that there's this national average. It's this dark, bold line. And you can see that some districts are well below the national average. And those are districts like Milwaukee and Chicago. And some districts are way above the national average, and those are districts like Anne Arundel County, which is about 1.5 years ahead of the national average. And Clayton, I think you know where that district is because it's a pretty wealthy suburb in Maryland. And then way at the top, Chapel Hill Carrboro Schools. I'm sure you know where that district is. Go Tar Heels. That district is 2.5 years above the national average, third grade. All right, so kids are doing extremely well. But we all know that third grade test scores are not valid indicators of school and district effectiveness. Because third grade achievement scores reflect all the learning opportunities that children have had from birth to third grade. And so it's not just schools that are influencing achievement in third grade, it's a lot of things outside of school. So I have a better metric for you to assess how much do districts matter. And when they have this learning-focused infrastructure like ILTs for many, many years, how much does achievement actually improve? Do you know what that metric is? That metric is to look at these third graders 5 years later when they are in 8th grade and ask the question, where are these kids in 8th grade and what have districts done to contribute to their learning? Want to take a look at these kids 5 years later in 8th grade? Let's take a look, because I think the answer is going to surprise you. If you look 5 years later in 8th grade, what you will see is that in Milwaukee Public Schools, kids are even farther behind. They used to be 1.5 years behind the national average, and now it's over 2 years behind the national average. Kids in Anne Arundel County, they've actually dropped a little too. It used to be 1.5 years. Now it's only half a year. And you know, Chapel Hill Carrboro, those kids are just about the same. They have not gone ahead of the national average or gone below. But I want you to look at that yellow bright spot. And that big yellow bright spot is the Chicago Public Schools. If you look at the Chicago Public Schools, kids in third grade were 1.5 years behind the national average. And 5 years later, as 8th graders, those kids are only half a year behind the national average. Who said districts don't matter or schools don't matter? And because of this, the national press has pointed out that among the 2,000 largest districts from 2009 to 2015, Chicago students for all subgroups improve faster than students in any other major U.S. school district. So high school principals and Clayton and Frank, we were talking about test scores, and it's not just about test scores. High school principals, you are responsible not just for test scores, but for some very important outcomes that affect kids' life chances. What are those outcomes? How about high school graduation? How about going to college? Well, let's take a look at those outcomes. What happened to Chicago high school over a similar period of time? If we ask the question, what we find is that when you look at high school completion graduation rates, they went from 57 to 78%. Almost a 20 percentage point increase. And then if you look at 2 to 4 year colleges, that went from 50% to 63%. And so the national press pointed out that since 2011, the graduation rate at Chicago Public Schools has increased at nearly 4 times the national average, from 57 to 78%. Who said districts don't matter? Who said schools don't matter? If you look at this data, if you are a student in the Chicago Public Schools, over this 10-year period of time when they had a learning-focused infrastructure, they saw massive gains in achievement. And did you know that in the Chicago Public Schools, they cram 6 years worth of learning in 5 years of schooling? So CMS is also part of a strong educational ecosystem. And when I showed you that data earlier about how poor children in CMS have a harder time escaping poverty than children in any other U.S. city, a whole city has been engaged to restore opportunity in Charlotte. And this is the last page of the Breaking the Link report. It's an important, phenomenal report. And I like everything about the report. Nell showed you some data from the report. And do you know what my favorite part of this report is? My favorite part of this report are the last 2 sentences. I'm going to read them for you. Here's what the report said. It said, the Opportunity Task Force, that was a task force that was created after the Chetty report, emphasized that it is our collective responsibility to create paths toward prosperity. Its members were emphatic that neither schools nor school systems can lay such ground alone. We cannot ask schools to do all the work by themselves. And so I want to share with you that there is a very strong educational ecosystem here in Charlotte, because not only are those words words that are inspirational and aspirational, but they're words that have mobilized an entire city, because the Opportunity Task Force pointed out that in 2018, we have to solve our city's biggest problem. And our city's biggest problem is that children born into poverty are likely to remain in poverty their entire lives. We must do the work, and to create the needed change, we are open to new ideas as we seek an aggressive approach to confronting and attacking the issues facing us. And you may have also heard of Read Charlotte, which has been led by an amazing leader, Monroe Richardson, which is focused on doubling the percentage of third graders reading proficiently in third grade from 40 to 80% from 2015 to 2025. And there are many, many other partners, as you've learned about today, who make and help make Charlotte, Mecklenburg schools part of a strong educational ecosystem. You know, when I watch Hollywood movies, some of my favorite movies are about education, about teachers. If I asked you what are some of your favorite movies, you might say Stand and Deliver, right? That's Jaime Escalante, South Central LA. Or Dead Poets Society. Well, you know what? A lot of these movies that you watch, I think, communicate to us that basically, look, what Hollywood says is that U.S. schools, they really need a Superman or a Superwoman. And so we have movies like Waiting for Superman. Well, you know, and I know, that there's no Superman or Superwoman. But I have good news for you, and the good news is that we are the ones we are waiting for. And so what is the good news? The good news is that you have identified an important problem space. You have identified a practice that catalyzes ambitious instruction and student outcomes, and you have developed a learning-focused infrastructure to grow these practices, and CMS is part of a strong educational ecosystem. Okay, so good news number 4, and by the way, this isn't just good news, this last point here, this is great news. Because we have been together learning towards a solution to address the rich-poor gap in reading and writing. Did you know that? And here's what the solution is. The solution that we've been working on looks like this. Basically, the solution that we focused on integrates ILT practices around content-rich curriculum. So when Clayton talked about his strategy, he pointed out the importance of access to diverse, rigorous curriculum that's content-rich. And we know that academic conversations and academic writing, those practices don't happen in a vacuum. Those practices happen in the context of rigorous content by way of complex text. And so what we've been doing this year is we've been trying to not bring in a new program, but integrate ILT practices around content-rich curriculum. But content is underemphasized. So national surveys show the following. The ECLSK survey that I showed you at the beginning of my talk that has those figures, it also tells us how much teachers actually spend on different areas of education. And what the ECLSK survey shows is that content is underemphasized because when we look at the elementary grades, and you see this big purple, over 80% of U.S. elementary school teachers teach English language arts 5 days a week, and on average, each of these sessions is 2 hours in length. But when we ask teachers, how much do you spend on those content areas where kids are going to acquire knowledge? The answer is much more disappointing because less than 20% of U.S. teachers spend 5 days a week on science. And the average length of a science lesson, 30 minutes. So why are the cornerstone lessons that we just worked on this year that focus on essential questions so important in K-12? Why do we do this from the early grades all the way to the high school grades, and why is it so important? The reason this is so important is because poor readers are likely to have gaps in knowledge. Since what a person already knows is the principal determiner of what she can comprehend. The less she knows, the less she can comprehend. So it's after lunch. When I agreed to give this keynote talk, I was really crossing my fingers that I'd go before lunch. But I'm going after lunch, and I want to provoke you and make you a little anxious because I'm going to quiz you. So you ready for the quiz? All right, here you go. I know, you're all saying, bring it on, Jimmy. All right, so here's a quiz. I'm going to read you 2 passages. I'm going to read you passage 1. And then when I ask you, what sport is this? And then I'm going to read you passage 2. I'm going to ask you, what sport is this? To illustrate my point. Are you ready? Here's passage 1. Callis and Rhodes put on 84, but with the ball turning, Mark Waugh could not hit with impunity, and his 8 overs cost only 37. The runs still had to be scored at more than 7 and over, with McGrath still to return, and Warren having 2 overs left, when Rhodes pulled rifle to Bevan at deep square leg. Okay, when I read that to you, and you read that, you were probably saying, well, there's a ball in this sport, so maybe it's basketball or football, and it turns. And then when I got to 8 overs costs only 37, you started scratching your head and going, I have no idea what this sport is. And then when I read, I have to tell you, when I read this passage and I read Rhodes pulled rifle to Bevan a deep square leg, I thought it was a bunch of guys going quail hunting and someone shot a rifle and they've got their hound dogs. This sport is, of course, cricket. And given that about half of you knew what that sport was, those of you who knew what that sport was, I want you to send me a new passage that's harder than cricket so I can use it in my next talk. And so here's my point, leaders. My point is this. The principal determiner of whether you can comprehend passage 1 is whether you know something about cricket. And the principal determiner of whether you are engaged when you are reading passage 1 is whether you knew something about cricket. Because we can have close reads of complex text, but close reads of complex text are often cold reads if you know nothing about the content. So let me read for you passage 2. My goal is not to stress you out. It's summer. I'm here to give a keynote talk. So I picked an easier sport, so here we go. You ready? They're sound in what they do. Defensively, they are a good tackling team. They have great corners. Obviously, the pass rush is good. Their linebacker play goes without being said. They're outstanding. And then offensively, they control the clock and they pound you into submission. So it's going to be important for us to play an excellent game. And so when I read this to you, and you read this on your own, you know exactly what this sport is because you know that great corners are those guys on defense who cover the wide receivers. And you know the linebackers are those bigger guys behind the defensive linemen who tackle the running backs, who get through the defensive line. And you know the phrase, pound you into submission, is about teams who have really good running backs. And of course, do you know who this is? This is Jay Gruden of the Washington Redskins talking about how good of a team the Carolina Panthers are. And the principal determiner of whether you can comprehend passage 2, where Jay Gruden is praising the Panthers, is whether you know something about football. And the principal determiner of whether you are engaged when I read the second passage to you is whether you knew something about football. And you know what? Jay Gruden was right, because when the Washington Redskins played the Carolina Panthers 2 years ago, they killed them 44-16. Now, I have to tell you that I'm from, my hometown is Boston, Massachusetts. And we have a pretty good football team up there called the New England Patriots. I know. Now you're awake. I was wondering if you're awake. Now, I'm not from Boston. I'm from Washington, D.C., so that's why the Redskins came up. But the New England Patriots, we think in Boston that we're a dynasty. And so we're already predicting in Super Bowl 53 on February 3rd, 2019 in Atlanta that we're going to be in the Super Bowl. But because I'm in Charlotte, we all know we're going to play the Charlotte Panthers. And when the Charlotte Panthers play the Patriots, we know that the Panthers are going to destroy the Patriots. Okay, Jimmy, get back on topic. So let me get back on topic. So I have a question for you. How many Cornerstone lessons did you do this year? Well, what's the goal? 1. What if we do more Cornerstone lessons, not just 1, but 10? What do you think happens? So I've been working with a set of schools in Charlotte-Mecklenburg, and these schools are amazing. And we've been working together for 3 years, and we developed something called MORE, and MORE just stands for Model of Reading Engagement. And the reason we call it a model of reading engagement is that America has moved from an era of accountability to an era of engagement. And so when I tell you that we've got to engage kids to build these knowledge-based competencies, what I'm saying to you is that we have to impact kids' heads, their hearts, and their hands. We have to move their cognition, their motivation, and their behavior. So we developed this curriculum program called MORE, and this was developed in CMS with CMS teachers. And so this is a partnership that I've had the privilege of leading. And MORE has 4 components. And so I'm going to teach you the mnemonic. It's the ABCDs of MORE. And we just did a study this spring where we implemented this for 10 days. And A just stands for access to complex concepts in science and social studies. How are kids going to acquire knowledge if we don't give them access to complex concepts in the content areas? And as I said earlier, this is something that Clayton emphasized in the strategic vision. And B just stands for books that build kids' motivation and self-efficacy. So we use nonfiction text, and they're very hard. We do this in first grade. Most of the texts, they're at a second, third, fourth grade level. And then C just stands for comprehension instruction that integrates reading and writing for several days. And D stands for developmentally adapted activities that match students' needs. That's a mouthful. What does a D mean? It just means that, you know, even in first grade, some kids need some help with word reading and fluency, so we make sure that we include those activities for those kids. Kids are at very different levels of development. But I want to say something to you about the ABCDs and more. Personalization is a really hot topic, isn't it? You hear the P word all the time. What should we personalize to help all kids become better readers and writers? There's a more important question than what should we personalize. And that more important question is what should we not personalize? What should we never personalize to ensure equity, just as Dr. Duke talked about, Dr. Wilcox. And I'm going to argue that it's the A. We should never personalize access to complex concepts. And so here's what we did in MORE. We taught kids a 10-day grade 1 unit on the theme of animal survival and the Arctic ecosystem. And why did we pick this? Because this is connected to the next generation science standards. And so we taught kids words like animal and survive, which are words that many first graders know. And we also taught kids words like behavior, physical characteristic, adapt, and advantage. And these are words that are high utility because they're useful across content areas in all grades. And then we taught kids discipline-specific words like endangered, extinct, and interdependent. But we embedded these words in a semantically very meaningful context. And the most important thing that I want to show you in this slide is when I read these words, this is not how your brains arrange information. And the reason is because knowledge is networked. And so the way that your brain organized the information is you were able to take those words and you were able to have a fully arborized concept network in your brain. And so we know from many, many years of literacy research, and this is a great quote by Monty McGowan, who's a vocabulary researcher, that our word knowledge is more like a complex network of connections among words that have features or associations in common. And so what we did is we taught these words, and we taught kids how to connect these words in a concept map. And so we had an essential question, and we highlighted connections between words for students. And so when we did this, we got this in first grade. This is a first grade classroom where what you can see is the teacher has an essential question: how do animals survive in their habitat? And then you can see that there are each of those words, the easy words, the words that have high utility across content areas, and the discipline-specific words, and kid-friendly definition, like behavior is something an animal does, and then there are examples. But all these words are networked, and they're part of a semantically meaningful context where we have an essential question. Well, why is this so important? So the principals who raised their hand and said they've been working with me and practices matter and more, we went back and talked to the teachers after we ran this study this spring. And we asked them what worked well, what didn't work well, and I'm going to share with you some things that we learned. One teacher said, I love the way the concept map helps students organize and explain their thinking. Another teacher said, we were able to foster academic conversations. And so this teacher told us, I really enjoyed how the concept map allowed them to discuss and defend their thinking. It also made a great connection to what our brains do when we learn new information. Scholars would always come back to the concept map when explaining their thinking ideas. This is tough stuff. And Nell talked about higher expectations. I want to tell you something. Struggling readers are not struggling thinkers. And so one of the things that we have to do is we need to let teachers hear their kids sound really smart, right? And we need to remember that we shouldn't talk to 6-year-olds like they're 6-year-olds. We should talk to them like they're 10 and 15-year-olds because they can understand a lot more through listening than they can through reading. And that's what we did. But we still had those foundational literacy activities kids needed. Okay. And we teach kids some simple fluency activities if, again, they need those activities. So we teach kids things like share a book, high and low reader, sit side by side, track with one smooth finger, eyes on the words, 2 voices, not too fast, not too slow, write down crazy words, have fun. And I have to be honest with you, this is really just an idea that I got from my favorite website, GoNoodle. And on GoNoodle, my favorite band is Blazer Fresh, and of course they remind us, don't read like a robot. And that's all we're teaching the kids if they need those additional supports. And so let me ask you the question. Suppose we do this Cornerstone lesson for 10 days, and we compare it to what we've been doing in CMS, business as usual. Can grade 1 students evaluate complex texts? So remember that passage I read for you at the beginning of today's talk? Remember this passage down here about animals in the ecosystem? The rainforest is home to unique plants and animals that don't live anywhere else. When a rainforest is destroyed, these plants and animals are destroyed with it. Some rainforest animals are becoming very rare. For example, there were once thousands of woolly spider monkeys. Now there are only a few hundred. This is bad news for many plants, flowers, and fruits that need spider monkeys to carry their seeds from place to place. Because of the interdependence between animals and plants in the rainforest, what hurts one organism could hurt many organisms. And then we try to understand if kids can understand this kind of complex text. And so the question, the million-dollar question is this. We wouldn't be surprised if kids who knew more about Arctic ecosystems, because after all, that's what we taught them about. But what we want to understand is, can students transfer knowledge about Arctic ecosystems to rainforest ecosystems after a 10-day more unit? Because no one has seen that passage or been taught how to understand the passage. And so we asked this question: what will happen to the woolly spider monkey if its habitat is destroyed? It will become a species, extinct, unique, or endangered. And we are learning towards a solution because in the spring of this year, we did one of the most rigorous studies, a randomized controlled trial in 10 CMS K-5 schools with 38 classrooms, where classrooms were randomly assigned to do what they normally do, or they were randomly assigned to do 10 of these cornerstone lessons. And I want to show you some of these results, and these results are fresh out of the oven as of the last 48 hours, because we just got the data back. And so here's what we learned. If you look at the percent of kids who could correctly answer the question that I just showed you, we can see that in the business as usual condition, it's 1/3 of the children. What percentage of US 8th graders are proficient at reading complex texts? Remember that figure? 1/3. So business as usual, 1/3 of the kids can evaluate complex nonfiction tests, like the one I just read for you, but in more, it's 2/3 after 10 days. That's a huge difference for such a short intervention. And so what about students' academic writing? You're probably thinking, can they write with evidence in response to complex nonfiction text? Well, we haven't analyzed all of this data, but I will just share with you a couple of responses that we've gotten from kids. And the most important thing that I want to point out here is that we asked kids, should people be allowed to cut down trees in the rainforest? Why is this a good question? It's a good question because it's debatable, it's discussable, and there's no right answer. And it will require kids to orchestrate the evidence that they've learned about and acquired to answer this question. So let me share with you some things that first graders wrote. Here's what one first grader said: I think that they should not cut down trees because it's a habitat. And if one animal gets extinct, all of the animals will be extinct. And trees give us oxygen, and flowers and give us oxygen as well. And another child said, yes, people should cut down trees because the people in the rainforest need the trees to build houses in the rainforest to live in. This is why people should cut down trees. And then finally, let me read you this passage over here. They should not be allowed to cut down trees. It's wasting food. It's helpful to have medicine from insects. The plants are natural resources we need. Only cut down a few rainforests because we're not going to survive with just shelter. So it's not such a great idea because we need food, medicine, water, and plants. So really don't do this to endangered animals. I don't really think this is a great idea. People should not be allowed to cut down trees allowed. Well, do you see all those bolded words? We didn't tell kids to use those bolded words in their writing. We just asked them the question. But see, if we teach kids complex texts and we have very high expectations for them, they not only meet our expectations, they exceed our expectations. And so what is the good news? The good news about teaching and learning in Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools: you have identified an important problem space. You have identified a practice that catalyzes ambitious instruction and student outcomes. You have developed a learning-focused infrastructure, ILTs, to grow these practices. And CMS is part of one of the strongest educational ecosystems in the country. And together we are learning towards a solution to address the rich-poor gap in reading and writing. So it's only been 3 years that I've been working with you as a result of the CMS-Harvard partnership. But just think what we can do over the next 5 years with Reach Every Reader. You may have heard in March the Chan Zuckerberg Institute funded a 5-year initiative to reach every reader to ensure that all kids are reading proficiently by 3rd grade. And I'm so excited to work with you on that project. And just to make a plug, thanks for letting me share more at 10 a.m. with the 30 Principles in the Practices Matter study and the more studies. I want to share the good news about our results because I have more good news to share, and I also want to extend an incredible invitation to you to keep partnering with us. So I want to circle back to what I said at the beginning of my talk, and I want to ask you all, what is a great civil rights issue of our time, of our generation? Well, do you know what the new CMS superintendent said? He said, literacy is a new civil right. And I agree with Clayton, and I'm going to just use his eloquent words from January 2nd, 2017, when he said, I've said several times in this community that the new civil rights issue is literacy. In the 21st century, all of our kids, whether they are white, black, brown, or if they come from another country, are having trouble with their language. If they are not articulate readers, speakers, thinkers, reviewers, they're going to have a hard time being successful. So Fannie Lou Hamer, back to Miss Hamer. She was a daughter of Mississippi sharecroppers. She often liked to sing this song. And she would sing this song during the protests like the Great March from Selma to Montgomery that led to the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And you know, the 1965 Voting Rights Act transformed American democracy because just 1 year before that act was passed, less than 10% of black Mississippians were registered to vote. And the year after the Voting Rights Act, 2/3 of black Mississippians were registered to vote. And Fannie Lou Hamer often sang this song, and I know many of you, if not all of you, know what this song is. This song, of course, is This Little Light of Mine. I love this song. This is one of my favorite African-American spirituals. Here are the lyrics. Now, I'm not going to sing this song for you, and I'm not going to ask you to sing this song as well. But I am going to ask you to do something. Because there's been a lot of bad news about American education in the state of North Carolina and the city of Charlotte. What I'm going to ask you to do is to share the good news about teaching and learning in Charlotte-Mecklenburg Schools. Share the good news. This is CMS, and so many other districts have much to learn from you. And I'm going to conclude by exhorting you to let your light shine very, very bright. Because do you know what you are? I've been here 3 years. I've come down almost every 4 to 6 months, and I've been incredibly impressed with the work that's been going on at CMS. I want you to let your light shine because you are a city on a hill for the rest of America. Thank you.